Hello guys, and welcome back to our channel. Now I welcome you to a conversation that's long overdue. Today we are going to talk about the brutal truth of the Atlantic slave trade and the lies that have been told about it for far too long. Now in this video, Professor Moore is here to share with us a book that has left a lasting impact on him. The Slave Ship, A Human History by Marcus Rediker. Now, he says this book is not an easy read, but it's a necessary one. As Professor Mo shares, reading this book was an emotional and disturbing experience, but it's one that everyone should undertake. At a time when many schools are palm color washing the history of slavery, books like this one are more important than ever. Now, this book tackles the ugly truth head on and refused to shy away from the horrifying violence that was inflicted upon enslaved people. And one of the most striking takeaways from this book is that slave ships were not just vehicles for transporting enslaved people, but were in fact floating tea to the char chambers. Now, as we were exploring this video, the lies and distortions that we see today about slavery are nothing new. Actually, they started during the slave trade itself, with slave ship captains testifying that they treated enslaved people with kindness and care. But as we will hear, this was a bold-faced lie. Now, the reality was one of unimaginable cruelty with enslaved people being treated as property, not human beings. From the cramped and unalived conditions of the cargo hold to the dark abolitionist humor that emerged as a form of resistance, we will take a look into the shocking truth of the slave trade. So let's get started. Take a look at this video. We'll be right back.
Hey everybody, Professor Moore here, and I have another book recommendation for you. The Slave Ship, A Human History by Marcus Rediker. This is seriously one of the best books I've ever read on the Atlantic slave trade. However, it is definitely not an easy read. While reading this book, there were times that I cried, I got physically sick, and I got so depressed I had to put it down and spend a couple of days recovering. With all of that said, I still believe that absolutely everyone should read this book. This book doesn't shy away from the ugly truth and horrifying violence of the slave trade. It tackles that truth head on, and for that reason, it is indispensable for anyone interested in learning the real history of slavery. At a time when many schools are whitewashing or banning this type of history, we need books like this now more than ever. One of the biggest takeaways from this book is that slave ships were not just vehicles to transport enslaved people. Abolitionists called slave ships floating dungeons, but they could more accurately be described as floating chambers. And this is something that slave traders tried their best to lie about and hide. What's interesting is that the whitewashing and distortion of slavery that we see today is nothing new. This started during the slave trade. Slave ship captains repeatedly testified that they treated the slaves on their ship good and took great care to make sure that they were healthy and happy. But this was a bold-faced lie. Slave ship captains treated enslaved people as property, not human beings. They shoved them into the cargo hold of their ships where there was little to no ventilation. Disease spread rapidly, and many people from sickness, starvation, or suffocation. Ultimately, almost 2 million Africans on these slave ships before they even reached a plantation. One of the major milestones in the anti-slavery movement came when abolitionists produced a drawing of the slave ship called the Brooks. This image showed how enslaved people were packed into these ships like commodities, with barely any room to move or breathe. The Brooks could hold over 600 slaves, and during its lifetime, it carried over 5,000 enslaved people from their homes to distant plantations where they were condemned to be worked to death. From the moment that Africans stepped on slave ships like the Brooks, they found ways to protest their enslavement, and slave ship captains found ways into submission. One common form of protest was for enslaved people to refuse to eat. So in response, slave ship captains used tools to pry their mouths open so they could be force-fed. Enslaved people were constantly revolting on these ships. And whenever these revolts were put down, the captain usually punished the ringleaders in the most horrific way possible to strike fear in the hearts of the other people on board and deter them from following their example. On one British slave ship, a rebel leader was executed, and then the captain forced the other enslaved people on board to eat his heart and liver. On this same ship, a rebellious African woman was strung up by her thumbs and slashed with knives until she died. After another revolt on a different slave ship, an enslaved man was tied to the ship's masthead and left there for 5 weeks. He was barely given any food or water and result. One of the worst punishments that slave ship captains threatened rebellious slaves with was being fed alive to sharks. This was a common practice that is well documented in the historical records. On several occasions, slave ship captains brought all of the enslaved people to the upper deck and gave them a demonstration of what would happen if they were thrown overboard. The captains often took a slave and lowered them into the water with a rope and made the enslaved people watch as the body was torn to shreds in a feeding frenzy by sharks. These demonstrations were also used as a deterrent for enslaved people who might want to jump overboard, preferring drowning to a life of enslavement. The goal of this was to show them that it would not be a death, but it would be painful and terrifying. So many enslaved people, both dead and alive, were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean that sharks frequently followed these slave ships because they knew that they would always be fed. This was such a common form aboard slave ships that in 1792, abolitionists wrote a satirical petition by sharks to the British Parliament, asking them not to ban the slave trade so they could continue to get free meals. In the petition, the sharks explain that by hovering round these floating dungeons, your petitioners are supplied with large quantities of their most favorite food, human flesh. Should the abolition of the slave trade take place, the prosperity of your petitioners will inevitably be destroyed, and their numbers, by being deprived of their accustomed food, rapidly diminished. Knowing that enslaved people thrown overboard were eaten by sharks makes the following story that much more horrifying. One of the stories that Rediker draws attention to in his book is the 1781 Zong. The Zong was a British slave ship heading to Jamaica in 1781 with 417 enslaved Africans. During the voyage, several enslaved people on the ship became sick, causing the captain, Luke Collingwood, to panic. He knew that if he arrived in Jamaica with 6 slaves, the plantation owners would not buy them and he would lose thousands of dollars. So he came up with a plan. Slave trading was an extremely expensive endeavor, so most slave ships were funded by major corporations, and these corporations had insurance policies. Part of the insurance policy was to reimburse slave ship captains for any enslaved people that due to drowning, which was something that was common on the Atlantic Ocean during storms. Therefore, Captain Collingwood came up with the idea to get all of the 6 slaves and throw them overboard, then lie that they drowned in a storm. This way, he could file an insurance claim and not lose any money. Altogether, the captain threw 132 sick enslaved people into the ocean, intentionally to save his profits. The truth eventually came out, and some of the crew members of that ship were put on trial, but no one was ever punished for these. Many enslaved people were thrown overboard to drown, even if they weren't sick, as a cruel form of punishment. In 1791, a New England slave ship captain named James de Wolfe was brought up on charges for throwing an enslaved woman overboard in her. The captain tied her to a chair and threw her overboard so she would sink and drown. Afterward, when someone asked him if he had any remorse, he said that he was sorry that he lost a good chair. James de Wolfe led 25 slaving voyages, and as a result, he became the richest man in New England. He was never charged for the enslaved people on his ships. In fact, later he became a wealthy and respected U.S. senator. Hardly any slave ship captains were ever punished for or enslaved people on their ships. More often than not, they were rewarded with millions of dollars and elite positions in society. The reason why I love Rediker's book so much is he doesn't hide the fact that slavery was instrumental in the creation of the modern capitalist world, and he ends his book by calling for reparations to the descendants of the enslaved. This book is not only an academic analysis, it is a call to action. In his conclusion, Rediker says, "What do the descendants of De Wolfe, Their families, their class, their government, and the societies they helped to construct owe to the descendants of the enslaved people they delivered into bondage. It is a complex question, but justice demands that it be posed and answered if the legacy of slavery is ever to be overcome. There can be no reconciliation without justice.
Now, for more than 3 centuries, slave ships carried millions of people from the coast of Africa across the Atlantic to the New World. Much is known of the slave trade in the American plantation complex, but little of the ships that made it all possible. Now, in The Slave Ship, award-winning historian Marcus Rediker draws on 30 years of research in maritime archives to create an unprecedented history of these vessels and the human drama acted out on their rolling decks. He reconstructs in chilling detail the lives, unalivings, and terrors of captains, sailors, and the enslaved aboard a floating dungeon trailed by sharks. From the young African kidnapped from his village and sold to the slaver by a neighboring tribe, to the would-be priest who takes a job as a sailor on a slave ship, only to be horrified by the evil he sees, to the captain who relishes having a hell of my own. Rediker illuminates the lives of people who were thought to have left no trace. Now, this is a tale of tragedy and terror, but also an epic of resilience, survival, and the creation of something entirely new, something that could be called African American. Now, Marcus Rediker in this book restores the slave ship to its rightful place alongside the plantation as a formative institution of slavery, as a place where a profound and still haunting history of race, class, and modern capitalism was made. Now, before I share my 2 cents and research on this, I just want to share Marcus Rediker's book summary, The Slave Ship, A Human History, which is a powerful and haunting account of the transatlantic slave trade, one that sheds light on the darkest corners of human history. Through meticulous research and masterful storytelling, Rediker reveals the shocking truth about the slave trade, a truth that has been consistently distorted, hidden, or palm color washed by those who seek to downplay or deny the horrors of this period. Now, one of the most striking aspects of Rediker's book is its unflinching portrayal of the brutal conditions on slave ships. He describes the cramped and unsanitary conditions, the rampant disease and unalivings, and the sheer terror and despair that gripped the enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Now, these conditions were not anomalies, but rather the norm, and Rediker's account makes it clear that the slave trade was a vast and complex system of exploitation and violence. Rediker also sheds light on the role of slave ship captains, who were often portrayed as benevolent figures, but in reality were ruthless and calculating individuals who treated enslaved people as nothing more than cargo. Now, he reveals the ways in which these captains used violence, intimidation, and manipulation to maintain control over their human cargo, and how they profited from the suffering and labor of the enslaved. Perhaps most importantly, Rediker's book highlights the urgency and resistance of the enslaved themselves, who found ways to resist, revolt, and survive despite the unimaginable conditions they faced. Now, he tells the stories of enslaved people who fought back against their captors, who formed communities and alliances on board the ships, and who found ways to maintain their cultural identities and traditions in the face of overwhelming oppression. Now, the truth and facts that Rediker presents in his book are a powerful corrective to the myths and distortions that have been perpetuated about the slave trade. They remind us that the slave trade was not just a regrettable chapter in human history, but a system of violence and exploitation that was deeply, deeply embedded in the economies and societies of the Western world. They also remind us that the legacy of the slave trade continues to shape our world even today, and that people must confront and reckon with this legacy in order to build a just and equitable society. Now, in the history of the slave trade and its repression, sharks have played a large part in the narratives which detail the Atlantic crossing. Also in painting, artists such as Winslow Homer and Joseph M.W. Turner have realistically represented these voracious predators who would follow slave ships from purchase to sell sport, eager to shatter in a few seconds the bodies of the enslaved men and women who would fall ill, and also those of the insurgents, leaving a striking trail of blood. Now, a brutal instrument of control of the sailors and of the enslaved. One can estimate that in 300 years, sharks have devoured more than 1.8 million bodies that were thrown into the Atlantic. As part of the slave trade, they would always parade around the ships and have also swallowed documentation on the infamous trade evidence that was found perchance by the British. What happened when the slave ships left the coast and commenced the infamous Middle Passage? Well, according to abolitionists, Sharks followed the slaver all the way across the Atlantic, feasting on body parts all the way. Now, Thomas Clarkson, not surprisingly, appears to have been the first to make the claim. Here, Clarkson related a story taken from a little manuscript about an officer of a Guinea ship who whipped an enslaved man until he was unalived and ordered the others to carry the unalived body to the water's side, where without any ceremony or delay, being thrown into the sea. The tragedy was supposed to have been immediately finished by the not more inhumane sharks, with which the harbor then abounded. Now, these voracious fish were supposed to have followed the vessels from the coast of Africa, in which 10,000 slaves were imported in that one season, being allured by the stench and daily fed by the unalive bodies thrown overboard on the voyage. Now, anti-slavery writers of all kinds repeated the claim, and indeed the shark became a major symbol of the horrors of the slave trade. Did sharks actually follow the ships all the way across the Atlantic? Well, the modern study of the behavior of sharks suggests a group might have followed a slave ship from the African coast to the American. Both the tiger and bull sharks are capable of long migrations, and indeed this is proven by their existence in almost all parts of the world. Now, these two species are wide-ranging in temperature, climates, and adaptive to a wide variety of marine habitats. Now, the atrocities committed on the slave ships, as documented by Marcus Rediker, are a reminder of the inhumanity and cruelty that defined the transatlantic slave trade. The fact that enslaved people were packaged like cargo, forced into cramped and unsanitary conditions, and subjected to physical and psychological tea to the char is a testament to the depravity of the slave traders. Now, one of the most disturbing aspects of Rediker's account is the way in which enslaved people who refused to eat were forced to consume food against their will. The use of tools to pry open their mouths, a practice known as force feeding, is a gruesome reminder of the lengths to which slave traders would go to maintain control over their human cargo. Now, this was not just a matter of ensuring that enslaved people were nourished, but rather a means of breaking their spirits and asserting dominance over them. The fear of being thrown overboard and devoured by sharks was a constant threat that hung over the heads of enslaved people. Now, the use of an unalive body as a prop to scare others into submission is an example of the psychological warfare that was waged against enslaved people. Now, this was a deliberate tactic designed to instill fear and maintain control, and it is a reminder of the brutal and inhumane conditions that existed on the slave ships. The fact that enslaved people were treated as nothing more than cargo, to be bought and sold at the whim of their actors, is a reminder of the dehumanizing nature of the slave trade. The use of force feeding, physical tea to the char, and psychological manipulation to maintain control over enslaved people is a testament to the depths of cruelty and depravity that defined this period in human history. But all this is something that they always try as much as possible to hide. We have finally come to the end of the video, but what do our viewers have to say? Share your thoughts, your views, your contributions as well in the comment section. Thank you for always watching, and see you in our next video as we bring you another interesting video.